It's cold, and it's just the two of us in here. We have no choice, but the woman's voice cracked before she could finish the sentence. Her breath came out in thin white clouds, each one vanishing almost as soon as it appeared. The cabin door slammed, shut behind them as another violent gust of wind tore through the trees. Snow hammered against the small windows like handfuls of gravel, drowning the world outside in a howling white blur. Ayla stood frozen near the door, her fingers numb, her legs trembling so badly she wasn't sure they would hold. The silence that followed the slam felt heavier than the storm itself. Rayan dropped the backpack he had been carrying and ran a hand through his hair, already stiff with ice. The cabin was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, old, abandoned, and never meant to shelter anyone in weather like this. The fireplace was cold and empty, its stones blackened from fires long forgotten. The air inside was just as biting as the wind outside, as if the cold had seeped into the wood itself. "The road's gone," Ayla whispered, more to herself than to him. "I watched it disappear." Her phone lay useless in her pocket dead hours ago. No signal, no light, no way to call for help. Rayan knelt by the fireplace, forcing his stiff fingers to move as he searched for anything burnable. Broken chair legs, scraps of wood, a few brittle pages torn from an old notebook. He gathered them all, knowing it might not be enough. "We can't panic," he said, though his jaw was tight. "If we stop moving, the cold wins." Ayla wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the shaking. Every sound, the creak of the cabin, the roar of the wind, the distant crack of branches snapping under ice, made her heart race faster. She had never felt fear like this before, raw and absolute, with nowhere to run. When Rayan finally struck a match, it flared weakly, almost dying before catching. The small flame reflected in their eyes, fragile but alive. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just watched it, as if their lives depended on that tiny flicker. Outside, the storm showed no mercy. Inside, 2 strangers stood trapped between fire and frost, knowing the night had only just begun. The fire burned low but steady, casting long, unsteady shadows across the cabin walls. It wasn't enough to make the room warm, but it was enough to remind them they were still alive. Ayla sat close to the hearth, her knees pulled to her chest, watching the flames tremble as if they, too, were afraid of the night. Every now and then, the wind forced its way through the cracks in the wood, sending a sharp chill through the room and making her shiver all over again. Rayan fed another splinter of wood into the fire and rubbed his hands together. His fingers were stiff, aching from the cold, but he kept moving, afraid that stopping even for a moment would let exhaustion take over. He noticed Ayla's shaking grow worse and hesitated before taking off his scarf. It was worn and thin, but still warmer than nothing. He handed it to her without a word. She looked up, surprised, then slowly wrapped it around her neck. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the fire. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the storm scream outside, each lost in their own thoughts. The night felt endless, stretching and folding in on itself, time measured only by the fire's rise and fall. "My mother hated winters," Ayla said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "She used to say the cold makes everything honest. You can't pretend you're fine when you're freezing." She gave a weak smile, though her eyes stayed fixed on the flames. Rayan glanced at her, then nodded. "I think she was right." He stared into the fire, memories surfacing that he hadn't thought about in years. Mistakes, chances he never took, words he never said. The cold seemed to peel everything away, leaving only what was real. Hours passed like that. They talked in fragments, sharing pieces of their lives without going too deep, as if afraid that too much truth might be heavier than the cold itself. When the fire dimmed, they leaned closer, drawn together by necessity rather than intention. At one point, the wind roared louder than before, rattling the walls so hard Ayla gasped. "If the fire goes out," she whispered, fear tightening her voice, "we'll have no choice but to hold on, to stay awake, together." Rayan met her gaze and nodded slowly. In that moment, the storm outside felt distant. The real battle was here, against the cold, the dark and the long, unforgiving night that refused to end. Sometime before dawn, the storm finally loosened its grip on the mountain. The wind no longer screamed through the trees, but sighed instead, as if exhausted by its own fury. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, painting the room in a soft reddish light. Ayla stood first, her body aching from the cold and from sitting too long without rest. For a moment she didn't move, afraid that if she did, the fragile calm would break. The silence felt strange after such a violent night. She listened carefully, expecting the walls to shake again, but all she heard was the quiet crackle of dying embers and the steady sound of breathing beside her. Rayan sat slumped near the hearth, his eyes closed, his face drawn with exhaustion. Relief washed over her when she realized he was asleep, still warm enough, still here. She stood slowly and went to the small window. The frost had begun to melt, leaving thin trails of water that caught the pale morning light. Outside, the world looked unfamiliar, buried under a thick blanket of snow that sparkled as the sun rose. The storm had erased the road completely, but the sky was clear now, wide and calm, as if nothing terrible had happened at all. When Rayan woke, he followed her gaze out the window and let out a long breath. "We made it," he said quietly, as though speaking too loudly might undo everything. His voice sounded rough, but there was a note of disbelief in it too. Ayla nodded. The fear that had wrapped itself around her chest all night slowly began to loosen. The cold was still there, lingering in her bones, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like something they had endured, something they had survived together. Hours later, distant voices and the crunch of boots in the snow broke the quiet. Rescue arrived with warmth, blankets, and promises of safety. As the cabin door opened, sunlight flooded the room, chasing away the last shadows of the night. The space that had once felt like a trap now felt strangely small, almost intimate. Before stepping outside, Ayla paused and looked back at the hearth, at the blackened stones and the ashes of the fire that had kept them alive. "It's strange," she said softly, "how a night like that can feel endless, and then suddenly it's over." Rayan smiled faintly. "Some nights don't just pass," he replied. "They stay with you." As they walked into the cold morning air, the mountains stood silent around them, holding their story in its frozen stillness. A reminder of the night when survival turned strangers into something more than just two people waiting for dawn.